evening's event. It's very good to see so many of you. Just got a couple of slides to run through before I hand over to Mike Small, who's going to be running our event this evening. This is a webinar event. Sadly, it was going to be hybrid, but unfortunately, Mike hasn't been able to make it down to London, or is it up to London, for the event. So we've had to pool the face-to-face part of it. However, we're really chuffed that we can still run it as a webinar tonight. So hopefully you can see my slides. I'm just going to run through a couple of slides just to introduce you to the event and to Mike, and I'm going to hand over to him in a couple of minutes. And we're planning on running through till about 7:15. We've allowed maybe 10-15 minutes or so for Q&A, and then we'll close fairly promptly at 7:30. So very quick welcome and intro. I can't unfortunately do the intro for IRMA, but I can do it for ISSG, and I can do it for the BCS. If you're not already a member for the BCS, who are we? Well, we're the Chartered Institute for IT, the British Computer Society. We've got 67,000 odd members, mainly in the UK, but we have members spread across quite a number of countries, around 150 countries. And we have local branches up and down the UK, and something in the region of 50 plus specialist groups, of which IRMA and ISSG are just two. ISSG is the largest of those specialist groups. We have something in the region of 3,500 members, and we're concerned with pretty much all aspects of information security and cybersecurity, from forensics to hacking to cloud and just about everything in between. So you are very, very welcome to join us for our event this evening. Just a little bit of housekeeping, couple of things. We are recording the event, and the event will be posted on both IRMA and ISSG's website. It usually takes a week or a fortnight while they top and tail it and get it onto the website, but it will be available for those who want to review it later, or indeed those who haven't been able to make it. We've got lots of attendees registered for the event, so we'll be taking comments on the chat throughout. Both Andy Motari and myself will be monitoring that chat and trying to respond to you as we go through the event. But if you have any questions for Mike, we'd ask you to post them on the chat, and within that quarter of an hour at the end of the session, we'll entertain Mike with whatever questions you've raised throughout the hour. So we are recording the session, as I say. Just a quick introduction to Mike then. Mike has been doing his stuff for something in the region of 40 years experience in the IT industry. He's a distinguished analyst at Coventry Cole and a visiting lecturer in information security at the University of Salford in England. He's responsible for research coverage in security and compliance, mainly around cloud services, hence this evening's event. He's published extensive research into this area and provides consulting services to Coventry Cole customers around cloud policy and risk assessment. And indeed, he's doing another event with us. Hopefully this one will be hybrid, so London and webinar, on the 5th of September, and that's on cloud security posture management. So if you have an interest in that topic, then please do register for that event too. He's recognized as an authority on information security and data privacy, particularly in the use of cloud services. He's published extensive research into this area, as well as providing consulting services. In his previous career, he was the architect for a wide range of leading-edge system software and identity management solutions. Now, I'm not going to read through the rest of that. You can all do that for yourselves while I'm chatting. I think we've got another 15 or so in the waiting room, so let me just admit those 16 now. So we've got quite a number of people on the call. Apologies to those of you who've just been waiting a couple of moments. We'll admit people as they arrive, but for now, let me just spill over onto the final slide. I will remind you of this at the end of the event. We have a number of upcoming events, so Cloud Security Program, including this one, and Cloud Security Posture Management on the 5th of September. We're putting together our Legal Day series at the moment, so more on that just a little bit later. We're also going to do some future standards update events, particularly around Cyber Essentials and Cyber Essentials Plus, which will be changing again at the turn of the year. And we're planning some post-quantum cryptography events. I sense that that's going to be a big subject for us in the coming months and years. So that's it from me for now. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to hand over to Mike Small. Thank you, Mike.
Okay, thank you. And thank you everyone for taking the trouble to join this call tonight. So as you will have heard from my introduction by Steve there, that I spent a lot of my my career developing software and systems, particularly in the area of system software and security. And then I became an analyst. And it's very interesting to see the difference, because as an analyst, I have two groups of customers. One are the vendors who tell me that what they've got to offer is something that every customer should have. And the other group is the customers who say, we've got all these vendors telling us this stuff. What should I really do? And that is a major challenge. Now, the other thing that is really quite interesting to me is that over time, the perception and the way in which IT has been delivered and the perceptions around this have changed. That 10 or 15 years ago, I started to look at the cloud because this seemed to be something that was obviously to do with the future. But at that time, most of the customers were concerned that they couldn't trust the cloud service provider to look after security as well as they could. Well, that's interesting, because then it mutated into, well, we can't be compliant. And now I think it has been proven that most of the cloud customers, in fact, make a mess of their own security, and that the original concern, which was to do with not being able to trust the cloud, has turned into, well, we can't trust ourselves. And the complexity, the second thing is that throughout the history of IT, nothing ever seems to die. So the notion that the cloud was going to replace all of the on-premises and edge computing has not occurred. What has happened is that we now have a complex hybrid multi-cloud IT delivery system. And this raises many challenges. Now, so in Cuppinger Cove, we have a CISO council that meets quite regularly. And it's interesting that in a recent one, these were the 4 top things that CISOs came to us about. And the top of this was cyber resilience, and we'll talk about how justifiable that is. But this was top of the CISO agenda, which was followed by this notion of cyber hygiene. And it's interesting that Steve was just talking about some of the future talks which will really be covering this. And that then leads on to the question of cyber insurance, because the whole problem that we're faced with is that this complex hybrid system is something that we have become, as a society and as organizations, we have become extremely dependent upon. And so if in fact you are totally dependent upon it, then you are going to find it terribly difficult if in fact it goes wrong. I think 15 years ago, I remember talking to a CISO who was telling me that basically his concern was not related to the viruses and things attacking his PCs, because he believed that the business could continue without them. We're now in a situation where businesses can't continue without their IT, whether it's delivered by the cloud or on premises. And that alters cyber insurance, because cyber insurance used to be about restoring your IT systems, but now it's about restoring your business when it goes wrong. And that is a whole different area, which is concerning many organizations. And the final thing, which we will come back to, was about the concerns that they had around training the board level around cyber insurance and around cyber security. So when we look at this, organizations have been racing to digitalize. There has been this notion that if you could digitalize your customer interface, you could actually create new products, you could reduce costs. That now people complain to me that when they try to get hold of an organization, they're faced with a website or a chatbot, and all they want to do is to talk to a person. Now, this is the trouble with this is that if it goes wrong, you find yourself in a very difficult position because you don't have the systems. The story goes about the Norsk Hydro, which was effectively an aluminium smelting company that was attacked by ransomware. It found itself in this problem that the whole of the smelting processes depended upon the IT. And if the IT went down, then the whole thing would be destroyed, because it either gets too hot and blows up, or it gets too cold and it seizes solid. And they were only able to recover because the elderly ex-employees could remember how to run the business without the computers. So if you depend upon a computer to deal with your support queries, but you don't have a help desk and you don't have people and a helpline, then you are in a bit of a problem if your computers go down. And here are some of the examples that you can see that have happened recently. Royal Mail, I know because my daughter runs a small craft business. She was more or less put out of business for 3 weeks because she does a lot of business selling things overseas. But because Royal Mail couldn't deliver things because their IT systems weren't working, she was stopped from being able to do this. You see that even an organization that supposedly securely moves data finds itself attacked. That this has an impact not only to the organization itself, but to all of its customers. And the interesting, rather sad last one, number 3, is that this is the first case of a murder charge being raised against a set of hackers because it is claimed or alleged that a hospital in Dusseldorf, which was attacked with ransomware, found itself with the problem that a patient died because of this. And so these are the problems. And the reason why these are a problem is that from the perspective of the cyber attackers, ransomware and holding your organization to ransom because of a denial of service or whatever is in fact becoming a much better business model the more it is that you depend upon those IT systems. So more and more organizations are at risk. And this has led to the government taking an interest. And since we are a European, I work for a European organization. We have a European perspective on this rather than just simply a UK one. And whilst in the US, there was this Executive Order 14028, which was concerned with making changes to the systems so that they could defend against cyber attack. This was recognized in the EU. And in 2016, there was this EU directive, the so-called NIS directive, which, because at that point, the UK was part of the EU, and because it was a directive, that meant that the UK had to turn this into UK law. And so the result of that is there is still in UK law the echoes of that. Now, in the meanwhile, in the EU, there is this update to this directive, the NIS2 directive, as well as something else which I think other people have spoken about, which is the DORA, which is recognizing the necessity for continuity of service and resilience for financial services. So all of these are interesting things that we have to take account of. And one of the critical things, I'm going to talk in a moment about NIS2, but one of the critical things is that this actually makes the board responsible for cyber resilience, and that is good for getting attention. So let's look at these directives, the NIS1 and the NIS2. Now, in a sense, what happens with these directives is that they identify a group of organizations that are affected by the regulation. And in the initial one, these were what were considered to be the essential operators. And this was things like electricity and transport and banking and so forth. And the directive puts obligations on those organizations to ensure that they have taken steps that are appropriate to the risk and to prevent and minimize the impact of incidents affecting them, which ultimately means establishing policies which take account of all of these different effects. So in a sense, this is really just encapsulating what is good cybersecurity hygiene. And the fact that it becomes a regulation is a recognition by the governments and society that this is important and has an impact beyond just the organization, and that to try and raise a standard to make different organizations comply with these regulations. Now, so what's happened is that as time has gone by, this regulation was seen to be in need of update. Now, it's quite a complicated and long regulation, and you can see on the right-hand side, I've picked out some of the articles, but in effect, there are two distinct dimensions to this. One is the fact that at the EU level, there are things that countries now have to do. And you would think that perhaps they should have been doing this before, but in a sense, if you look at, for example, Article 6, which is coordinating vulnerability disclosures across the EU. So previously, there was not even a regulation or a directive or a law which said that if one EU country found a vulnerability, that they should tell all the other ones, which clearly is not right. But that's something which is EU specific. What is more interesting in general terms is that the scope of essential services has been widened. So effectively, this is a recognition that there is more and more industry sectors that have a wide societal impact if their IT or their digital services are not delivered. And so that is what has caused people to pay attention. Now, it may be that you're all the audience today are in the UK, and they may be saying, well, we're not part of the EU anymore. What do we care about this? Well, if you are a multinational organization, then you're almost certainly to have a presence in the EU. And so it will impact you because you have your organizational parts that are in the EU will be impacted. And so what you need to do is to figure out whether or not your industry, your particular industry sector is going to be involved in this. And it then sets out a set of security measures. Now, none of these security measures are in fact anything that's new. All of these, we should all recognize. They're nothing more than what you have found in ISO 27001, in all of the various frameworks that there are around all of this. What is new is the fact that the board will be held accountable for cybersecurity. And if there are incidents, it will be the board that takes the hit. And for those of you that remember Sarbanes-Oxley, which was a US law to do with the probity of financial reporting, it did not mention IT, but it made the CEO personally responsible. And because all of the financial reporting depends upon IT, that got the CEO to take IT security seriously. And so board level accountability is an enormously important part of making organizations take cybersecurity seriously. Now, all of these things that we were talking about are now being called under this general name, cyber hygiene. And indeed, like I said earlier on, there is no shortage of advice. You have ISO 27001, you have the NIST cyber security framework, and the CIS. There is this endless list of advice and regulations. So what we have done in Coppinger Cole is tried to derive from this an essential element. And we believe that cybersecurity is founded on identity and access management. Well, it's founded on, first of all, a culture that you have to take security responsibility seriously, and you have to train your staff. You have to know what you have that is at risk, and you have to control access. I don't think anybody could argue with that. And then the essential elements of this are built from things like malware protection, patch management, making sure that you keep things up to date, removing vulnerabilities, managing your network, controlling privilege, protecting the privacy of data and data backup, and planning an incident response. Now, in a sense, it's rather interesting because you can sort of say somewhere up at that line, below a point on that line, you're dealing with prevention. And prevention is really good. It's really important to prevent problems, but it's not sufficient, because the issue nowadays is no longer if you will be hit with an attack, but when. And so it's really seriously important that you have a way to respond effectively and efficiently when your organization is hit. So, and it's interesting because only within the last couple of weeks, IBM released their latest cost of a data breach report. And well, this is always an interesting thing. They always, how many days and how many dollars. But one of the things they did this time was they went through and analyzed this data, looking at how long and how effectively organizations had responded to data breaches, to look for what activities and what plans they had in place to look for the top cost mitigators. And of this, having this DevSecOps approach was the top, employee training was the next, and having an incident response plan was in fact the third most effective thing to mitigate the costs when you had a breach. And looking at the other end, what they called the major cost amplifiers were non-compliance. And isn't that interesting? Because I look at that in terms of there's an awful lot of advice out there, some of which is mandatory, you have to comply, you have obligations, some of which is advisory. But if you don't comply with the best practices, then that means it's going to cost you more. Obviously, security skills is something that we're all talking about. And the other issue is to make sure that your security systems are simple, because complexity adds to the likelihood of you having to cost more when something has gone wrong. So how well do organizations do? So I took the results from the UK, the annual cybersecurity breaches survey. And in a sense, when you look at this, there's an awful lot of interesting information in here. And what I've done is I've mapped as well I could the responses from the organizations in terms of how well organizations felt or they responded that they matched these things in the responses to this survey. And you can see what I have done is I've picked out some of the things that I feel are the bottom, and things like knowing what you have, having good training, and planning an incident response are things where they're not doing very well. So only 25% of the organizations that responded said that they have a formal incident response plan. And that doesn't look like a good thing to me. So that tells me that really it would be a good idea to have a good way of doing incident response. And indeed, that is one of the things that I've given another talk on in much more depth. But when you look at what that means in terms of the modern hybrid multi-cloud organization, you have to sort of see that incident response is a lot about organization, that you can't effectively respond to incidents unless you've already figured out who's going to do responding, how they are going to be organized, that you have the data and you have a plan to communicate internally and to communicate externally. And when you look at what goes wrong with these, you can see that invariably you can trace the areas back to one or more of those key things. Now, the actual process that you're going through involves this from detecting that you have an incident through to containing it, to trying to eradicate the malware, And what you need to be able to do is to restore your business. And that depends upon you having the data. If you don't have the data, it makes it much more difficult to respond and to recover and restore your systems. So that leads me to this notion that data resilience is now the critical thing. That there was a time when what people were concerned with was, well, what would happen if my data center burnt down? What would happen if my servers actually physically didn't work? What happened if my tapes were destroyed? But now, even so-called on-premises is in fact virtualized. It is a software-defined network with a software-defined infrastructure. Services are defined as infrastructure as code. So it's not just sufficient to have your application data. The whole of your service depends upon everything. So if you're in the cloud, then your cloud service is defined by data. So if somebody can come in and destroy the data that defines your organization, your servers, how they all interconnect, then that's as bad as destroying the data itself. So basically, data is key to running your business, and it's now also absolutely key to running your systems. Now, what a lot of organizations say to me is, well, look, we're running in the cloud. The cloud service is going to give us all the data resilience that we need. And this is a myth. The first thing is that responsibility for security is shared. Read the contract. And this diagram on the right gives you an idea of how that is sharing works if you look at an infrastructure as a service. So AWS, and that number, I can't even read the number of nines. I picked that straight off the AWS website. They give you that incredible level of durability. But if you delete a bucket, that bucket is gone. And no matter how hard you cry on AWS's shoulder, they cannot get it back. Office 365, most organizations are using Office 365 or one of these office productivity in the cloud. But again, there you find that they give you protection. They will do all kinds of things to help you protect against ransomware. But if you delete your data, if you delete it from the recycle bin, then it's gone. And so thinking that you don't need to back it up is not sufficient. And if you want to have high availability, the cloud gives you that opportunity, but you have to exploit it. Now, perhaps not all of you follow this, but there was a French cloud service provider, and maybe a year or two back, I can't remember, I think it was 2021, that they had a fire in one data hall in a data center. And this was a data center with 4 distinct data buildings, with each of which had a so-called availability zone in it. So this fire started in one of these data centers, and the fire service turned up. So they said, yeah, we're going to put that out, but we're not putting it out. We're not going to spray water on this if there's power. So the first thing they did was they cut the power to all 4 buildings. Now, so they put the fire out. Fortunately, no one was hurt. But they now had 1 burnt down availability zone and 3 that were dark. Now, I don't know how many of you have tried to start a data center from a dark data center. If you can do it in 2 or 3 weeks, you're doing extremely well. Now, at the same time, they had customers, and their customers had put their data into the cloud, but they'd only put it in that one set of centers. And so they were then trying to figure out what they were going to do because they couldn't get their business data. It had gone because the data centers had gone. So they could have, if they had taken the opportunity at the right time, have moved it or had backup copies in other parts of their cloud service, but they didn't. So simply believing that you're using the cloud is going to give you 100% data resilience is just not right. Now, on the other hand, the cloud is very useful for helping you to have backups because it does give you an alternative location, and it does give you the opportunity to have a kind of air gap. And it also, many of the cloud services, S3 in particular, have immutability capabilities. So recovery, if you've had one of these incidents, recovery depends upon you having data for you to be able to recover from. And like I was describing, the processes involved in recovery can be much more complex than simply re-imaging a disk. What in fact you may have to start with may be a dark data center. But whatever the situation is, if you don't have the data, you can't start. And so this process depends upon you having a backup. You have got to have had a backup, which is a clean backup. And that will then allow you to somehow or other re-image the disks and the data. And again, let me say that this all sounds very obvious, but on one occasion, I came across an organization that found that they were trying to restart everything. And they said, well, where's the data? Well, it's actually on a CD. It was on a disk. And so they said, well, do we have a disk reader? And the first thing they had to do was they had to send someone out to PC World to go and buy a disk reader, because normally they would just map a network drive, but they didn't have a network drive to map. So having managed to do that, you then need to go through some kind of process of retesting. And one of the challenges you're faced at this point is that you may or may not be sure that the data has been cleaned, because the approach that is taken by the up-to-date ransomware attacker is that before they make their attack manifest, they will have made sure that they've done things to either corrupt your backups or to leave traces that will allow them to come back later. And so you need to go through this process of testing the integrity of your data. And interestingly, you know, there's this old rule of only a fool breaks the 3-2-1 rule of backups, of having 3 backups and having one at least that is off-site, so that you are absolutely sure that it cannot have been tampered with. And so some people still believe that irrespective of where it is, they only really feel happy if there is a tape that is in a fireproof vault somewhere else. And finally, you've got to restore the service. And oh, and by the way, this isn't security that's doing this, because the security, the CISO will say the responsibility for doing most of these things is in fact in the operations department. And so unless you have actually made sure that you have an organization for incident response that includes the operations group, then it's probably not going to work very effectively. So what do you need to do? So one of the interesting things is that I, every couple of years, update our market research on the different DR solutions that are in the market. And it's really interesting to see how these have evolved over time. That there was a time when if you could get it onto a backup tape, then that was fine. But now it's not just being able to back up your on-premises solution. It's not sufficient to be able to put it into an appliance or into a disk. You're going to have to deal with cloud services, software as a service like the Office 365, and to deal with the kinds of volumes of data that you now find are in the cloud. I mean, there are organizations that have terabytes of business data that are sat in the cloud data lakes that they depend upon from day to day. Think of any kind of a vendor that has lots of photographic images of what they are selling, which you can look through, where there are hundreds of thousands of options. So we look at a number of things that each of these solutions should cover. So they need to cover everything. It's not adequate in this multi-cloud hybrid world to have a solution that just works for on-premises and another one that works for software as a service. Oh, and by the way, there's an awful lot of software as a service that is industry specific, and all of them have different interfaces. And so it's very hard for a vendor to be able to cope with all of that. Then where can you actually put the data? What choices do you have? Can you put it physically? You have to put it in the cloud and so on. And then how you're going to recover. So is it something that you're going to have to do it yourself? Is there a disaster recovery as a service, or do they offer a managed service? Because it's certainly the case that in many cases, organizations are not really equipped to deal with the full recovery process, and they need assistance. And interestingly, that's one of the benefits from cyber insurance, is that cyber insurance organizations tend to have availability of the kind of recovery technicians that you might need. Then you want to say, how are you going to protect that data? So you need to be able to protect it against the cyber attacks. Like I was saying, the ransomware attacker is going to try and get at your backup. They're also going to try and get at your backup process. And so it's very interesting that the weakest point in some of the backup processes is not the actual data itself, but the fact that there's an admin password. And if the attackers can get hold of the backup administrator password, then they're home free because they can actually do what they like. So you need to be able to look at the actual processes that are involved in the backup to make sure they are super secure. And also to note that you need to be able to detect and remove malware that might be in the protected data. And indeed, for those of you that are interested, if you look at the MITRE ATT&CK framework, MITRE ATT&CK chain, they describe in great and excruciating detail how attackers will in fact try to do that. And from a point of view of the simple security, it's surprising that we're now on TIS 1.3 And yet there are some organizations will say, well, they're still using TLS 1.1. How do you know that the data at rest is in fact properly secured, especially if you have regulated data? Do you have control of the keys? Is it being held in a cloud service in a geography where it's out of compliance if it's there? Are you able to control the access by give some kind of role-based access to administrators, which allows you to delegate the process so that individual lines of business can do it? Are you able to audit what has been going on? And if you are backing up sensitive and regulated data, can you prove to the regulator that you're meeting your obligations? So all of those things are important. And finally, what deployments are you protecting? And one of the interesting things is that, do you protect all of the different clouds and all of the different virtual environments? Because within these virtual environments, like I said at the beginning, there is an immense amount of data which is associated with the virtual components. They are effectively the infrastructure as code, which actually defines the servers and the service. To take a simple example, it's one thing to be able to say, I have taken a snapshot of the OS image of what is running in a Linux server. But unless you have, for example, on VMware or on AWS, captured the virtual machine, you've not got all of the data. And then if you look at software as a service, then each of the Office productivity tools are different. And you now have a wide and increasing range of business critical software as a service, from ERP to everything you could think of, which contains data that's vital to your business. And finally, how can you actually recover from disruption? And can you do it using a service that is guaranteed, that is certified, and that can deal with things like the whole stack, and that it can do it in a way which allows you to comply with regulations. So in effect, this is a challenge. And it's not surprising when you look at the challenges that I've set out that so few organizations have fully met them. But in summary, what this has said is that today's environment, where organizations have become more and more digitally based, that has increased the cyber risk. There is, in many organizations, there is no longer the opportunity, if you lose your IT service, to quickly replace it with paper or manual processes. And so that is a major challenge. Therefore, it has become that cyber resilience is an essential element of a successful digital transformation. And this depends upon good cyber hygiene. And if you don't do it yourself, you're going to find that there's going to be a government regulation or law that says you have to do it for your industry sector or for your business. And that cyber resilience depends upon data resilience, because most of the services that you now use are in fact software defined. So it's not just your business data that has to be protected, but the infrastructure as code and the definition of your services. And to be resilient, you need to be prepared. And there is a big market in data and resilience solutions, which you can find more details of if you follow this link. And in addition, if you're interested in what I've said today, we have an event in November called Cyber Revolution, where we're also going to be looking at the impact of AI on the cyberspace. So with that, I'll hand over back and say thank you very much. Have we got any questions? Thank you, Steve.
Hi, Mike. Thanks very much indeed. I just realised I was invisible for a second there. Got my invisibility cloak on. So yes, we've got a few questions here. I'm going to work back up the list from the bottom to the top, just so I don't miss anything out here. So we have a question from Tim Williams. Let me see if I can actually get Tim to speak on the call. Hi, Tim. How are you doing?
Hello, Steve. Good to see you again. And thanks, Mike, for an absolutely excellent and well-considered talk. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question really is about a couple of, I suppose, symptoms I've seen in both of your customer communities, in the vendor community and in the purchaser community, whereby everybody realizes that data, they need to think about data and they want to do projects around improving backups. But at the same time, the people who are thinking this way are not necessarily thinking about the emergent properties of the new solutions they're creating. So if they're going to back up all of an organization's data or a large part of an organization's data into a new backup solution, new backup platform, they're not necessarily thinking about how to protect all of the information from all the different applications and preserve all of the different application security controls which exist in the production systems. They're just thinking about how do I back it up? And very often they are trying to back it up into solutions which only have a single unchanging symmetric encryption key. And I've done some kicking the tires on quite a few vendor solutions, leading vendors, and I'm not going to name names, but they basically all, for convenience, tend to use single unchanging encryption key. They will cite the benefits of being able to get faster backups and faster restores because they've got a master data catalog and they can deduplicate the data because they can detect, have I seen this data before against my global hashing, so that I can therefore not take another physical copy of the data. But very few of them are thinking about how can I preserve my data provenance? How can I preserve the life cycle controls over the data that would exist in the source applications, so that if it comes back, it will have legal and evidential weight, say, for example, the British standard 10,008. Most of these vendors are just saying, your problem is a data problem, but they're not really seeing the whole of the problem. The whole of the resilience problem is a lot more than data. It's about how can you preserve the integrity, the accountability, the confidentiality of the data, not just its availability. And I think there's a really huge gap here in what the vendors are offering, and also quite a lot of customers are buying very incomplete solutions because they haven't really seen the whole of the problem. As that would be my sort of proposition. And I suppose my question to you is, have you seen any good practices in this area? Even down to, I approached Microsoft about whether they'd want Active Directory being used to maintain the controls around backup environment. Microsoft Black Hat said, no, don't use Active Directory to control identity and access management in backup environments. So that effectively, that's a leading vendor of identity and access management solutions saying, oh, use a different identity and access management solution in the backup environment. But that then means you've potentially lost your lifecycle provenance and your lifecycle identity and access management in the backup environment. So I think there's quite a lot of problems here that the vendors need to come to market with better thought through solutions. Anyway, end of long question.
Thanks, Tim. Long question. Mike?
Yeah, well, yeah. So in a sense, you very, very clearly explained one of the major challenges. Now, so in a sense, this is a mature market area. And in a mature market area, most of the vendors go into the future walking backwards. They are looking, their genesis came from being able to take a snapshot of a machine, not to look at the problem from the way you have put it. Now, what is happening is that some of the vendors are mutating into data management vendors. So they've realized that there is a market not just in being able to back data up, but being able to actually control your data, to control where you've got copies, to control all of this kind of stuff. So that's perhaps the most positive thing that I can say that I see. And some of the bigger vendors will preferentially talk to you about being a data management vendor to being a data backup vendor. Now, have they gone the whole 9 yards, as they say? Not really. So I don't see anybody, I've not seen anybody who is doing exactly what you're doing. There is a small French company that his name escapes me at the moment, that had a conversation with me that sounded very much like what you were talking about, but they're a relatively small one. So in a sense, there is the draw from the market, and there is the opportunity to sort of create these new solutions. And at the moment, clearly the vendors respond to what their market is asking for. And if they're not doing it, it's probably because many of the organizations that are using it don't realize the full extent of the problem. And that to some extent is why the data management vendors are selling their story, that backup is a much wider problem than just being able to take a snapshot of a machine or a database. So thank you, Tim.
Thank you, Mike, and that's really helpful to have that as effectively a product service category, data management, to look out for in the market. Really helpful.
Yeah, you go and look at the larger vendors. I don't want to say any names because, but most of them now, if you look at the backup bit, it'll say backup, but it'll also have a whole host of stuff which is to do with data management.
Yeah. Excellent. Thank you very much, Mike.
Right.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. I've just got a couple of comments here, really. John Mitchell said asset management is the bedrock of cybersecurity. If you don't know what hardware you have or where it is, then ditto with your software and your data, and you can't protect what you don't know about. And we had a little debate on the chat around, just doing that inventory management, knowing what you've got and where it is, and essentially knowing what data you've got and the context of the data, so that as you're backing it up, it's not much use to you if you don't know which applications it needs to be restored back into. And
can I use that as an opportunity to sell the next talk? Because that is one of the major problems with the cloud. And one of these problems with the cloud is that it used to take 3 months to order and get hold of a server. Now servers are created in milliseconds and disappear as quickly. And so in the cloud, you have that. And so come to the next session and hear about cloud security posture management.
Great sales pitch. Thanks, Mike. And for those of you who didn't hear at the start of the presentation, that's on the 5th of September. We're hoping it's going to be hybrid and that we will have Mike in the offices in London, but also on webinar. We're hoping that. We just have to wait and see at the moment because Mike may not be able to make it down to London for that day. If that happens, then we will run it as a webinar anyway. So that's the plan at the moment. So watch this space on that one. Jerry Smith made a comment. I don't know whether it's particularly backup related, but it was interesting. What comments has Mike on the Sky News what comments has Mike on the Sky News of this evening about the hacking of the electoral register between August 21 and August 22? Much was public, but also those not allowing their data on the full open register were also identified, around 27 million voters. He makes a great point that this is going to hit the headlines, and how do we respond to that as an IT community, I think, and keep a sense of objectivity and level-headedness. Any thoughts or comments on that one, Mike?
Well, I heard that on the news, and that's all I know about it. And I mean, this really is amplifying what I was describing at the beginning, that IT has pervaded so deeply into everybody's lives that it is no longer simply something that is just an adjunct that if it wasn't there would no longer really matter. But the fact that we have so much data that is held in so many systems that can then be stolen and misused is something that we all have to take very seriously. And that this is why governments are starting to bring these regulations in to try and get people to deal with that data in a better way. And in effect, that is all cyber hygiene. And I can't remember what the slide number was, but it's not rocket science. It's like John Mitchell just said, if you don't know what you have, you can't protect it. And there's, if you will, a menu of things that we all need to be doing. And we all need to make sure that whoever is delivering these services is doing to protect this data in a professional and adequate manner.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mike. And just to wrap up on that point then, so I think you made a really good point earlier. Organizations, particularly organizations who've been around for a while, will have a mix of on-prem and these days almost certainly cloud. And the more complex and interconnected those get, they may not even be single cloud. The more complex and interconnected these things get, the more difficult it is to back up the data from all of those component bits that talk to each other in such a way that you can stitch it all back together again and make use of it and bring the system back up when it fails for whatever reason. So you know, it's a complicated world, and I think one of the points that you were making was to try, do your level best to simplify that and make it less complex. So that was absolutely brilliant. We've run out of time, unfortunately, but just a reminder, we have a follow-up session on cloud security posture management on the 5th of September. We hope to see you all again there. Just a couple of things then, been asked a couple of times this evening, have we recorded this session? Yes, we have. The recording will be posted to both the IRMA website and the ISSG website in due course. It normally takes a couple of weeks. I would just like to close by saying thank you ever so much to Mike Small for the presentation this evening and for handling the Q&A so well. We have a tradition in BCS, certainly within the ISSG, that when we have a speaker who gives up their time and their expertise to come and talk to us, we like to leave them with something just as a token of our thanks. So I'm going to organise a small gift for Mike from the ISSG with our compliments. We will do that post-event, but for now, there are no more questions. I thank you all. Mike, would you mind, and Andy, oh, Andy, do you have anything you want to say from IRMA just before we close down the call?
No, I don't have anything else apart from thanking Mike for this very useful presentation, and also thanking you for coming in at short notice and give a hand because of my failing voice.
You're really struggling today, Andy. Thanks very much indeed. Thanks, everyone. Mike, would you mind just, Mike and Andy, would you mind just staying on the call for a couple of minutes? We'll just have a short wrap up once we close the call down and everyone's left. Thank you, everyone.
Okay.
Thanks very much indeed.